On September 30th, 1941, Hitler announced the beginning of the decisive offensive on Moscow. The operation was codenamed Typhoon, and this name proved prophetic. Like a devastating hurricane, German tank wedges prepared to break through the Soviet defenses, encircle and destroy the main forces of the Red Army in the Moscow direction. The Soviet command, exhausted by heavy summer battles, failed to comprehend the scale of the impending blow. Three fronts, Western, Reserve, and Bryansk, stood in the path of Army Group Center, reinforced by fresh tank divisions transferred from other directions. The Wehrmacht concentrated about 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft for the offensive. At the forefront of the attack were the tank groups of Hoth and Guderian, masters of lightning warfare. On the morning of October 2nd, German troops went on the offensive. One of the most tragic pages of the Great Patriotic War began. An operation that would bring the defense of the capital to the brink of disaster and claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. By early October 1941, the strategic situation on the Soviet-German front was extremely unfavorable for the Red Army. After the catastrophic summer defeats near Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, Soviet troops suffered colossal losses in manpower and equipment. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal von Bock, having received significant reinforcements, was preparing to deliver a decisive blow in the Moscow direction. The German command developed Operation Typhoon, which envisioned powerful converging tank thrusts to encircle the main forces of Soviet troops west of the capital. To implement this plan, the Wehrmacht concentrated 75 divisions, including 14 tank and 8 motorized divisions. The total strength of Army Group Center reached 1.8 million men, supported by 1,700 tanks and over 1,000 aircraft. Opposing this armada were three Soviet fronts: the Western Front under General Konev, the Reserve Front under Marshal Budyonny, and the Bryansk Front led by General Yeremenko. Their combined strength numbered approximately 1.3 million men, 930 tanks, and about 670 aircraft. The balance of forces favored the enemy, especially in tanks and aviation, where their superiority was almost twofold. The qualitative state of the Soviet troops was particularly severe. Many divisions were only 50 to 60% manned. There was a shortage of experienced commanders, and communication between headquarters was intermittent. Most tank units were equipped with outdated vehicles, inferior to German ones in speed and maneuverability. The Soviet command, despite intelligence warnings, underestimated the scale of the impending offensive. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command expected the main strike in the southern direction and failed to reinforce the Moscow direction with reserves in time. The defense line was not a continuous front, but rather isolated strongholds with poorly prepared gaps between them. The Typhoon operation plan was developed by the German command with particular meticulousness. Hitler viewed the capture of Moscow as a key task of the Eastern Campaign. The Führer's directive of September 6, 1941, ordered Army Group Center to encircle and destroy Soviet troops in the Vyazma and Bryansk areas, after which a swift thrust was to capture the capital of the USSR. Field Marshal von Bock developed a classic double envelopment scheme. Two powerful strike groups were to deliver converging blows. The Northern Group, consisting of the 9th Army and Goth's 3rd Panzer Group, struck from the Dukovshchina area in the direction of Vyazma. The Southern Group, which included the 4th Army and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, advanced from the Roslavl and Shostka areas, also towards Vyazma and Bryansk. The German command meticulously prepared the operation, transferring significant forces from the Leningrad and southern directions. From the end of September, there was an intensive transfer of tank and motorized divisions, artillery, and aviation. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group alone included 5 tank, 3 motorized, and 7 infantry divisions, a powerful armored fist capable of breaking through any defense. An important advantage for the Germans was the concentration of aviation. The Second Air Fleet, under the command of General Feldmarschall Kesselring, numbered over 1,000 combat aircraft, ready to support the advancing troops. Aviation was intended to paralyze Soviet communications, destroy airfields, and suppress artillery. German panzer wedges received clear tasks: not to get involved in prolonged battles with resistance strongholds, but to advance rapidly, cutting off the retreat routes for Soviet troops. Infantry units were to follow the tanks and destroy encircled enemy groupings. Particular attention was paid to reconnaissance. The Germans carefully studied the disposition of Soviet troops, identified weak sections of the defense, and determined the directions of the main attacks. Aerial reconnaissance constantly tracked the movements of Soviet reserves and the state of defensive lines. By early October, Army Group Center was fully ready for the offensive. The morale of the German troops was high. Soldiers believed in a swift victory and the completion of the Eastern Campaign before the onset of winter. Commanders of all levels received detailed instructions and maps indicating routes of movement and objectives that needed to be achieved within specified deadlines. The Vyazma tragedy was largely the result of a series of fatal miscalculations by the Soviet command. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command and the leadership of the fronts failed to correctly assess the enemy's intentions and the scale of the impending strike. Despite intelligence reports on the concentration of German tank formations, the Soviet command continued to believe that the Wehrmacht's main blow would be directed southwards. Army General Georgy Zhukov, having inspected the troops of the reserve front at the end of September, reported on the unpreparedness of defensive lines and the low morale of personnel, but his warnings were not fully taken into account. The commander of the Western Front, General Ivan Konev, having received fragmented data on the preparation of the German offensive, could not build a comprehensive picture of the upcoming operation. One of the key problems was the catastrophic situation with communications. Front headquarters did not have reliable communication with subordinate armies, and they, in turn, often lost connection with divisions. As a result, even existing intelligence information did not reach all command levels in a timely manner. Many orders were delayed or did not reach the executors at all. The Soviet command made a serious mistake in building its defense. Troops were stretched over a wide front without creating a deeply echeloned system of fortifications. Reserves were unevenly distributed and could not be promptly redeployed to threatened areas. The commander of the Bryansk front, General Andrei Yeremenko, having received the task of preparing an offensive operation, concentrated his main forces on a narrow sector, exposing his flanks. In the absence of reliable information, the Stavka made decisions that did not correspond to the real situation. On September 27th, an order was given for the Bryansk front to go on the offensive, which led to a further weakening of its defensive capabilities. Army commanders, having no clear idea of the enemy's plans, could not organize effective anti-tank defense in the directions of the main strikes of German tank groupings. On the eve of the German offensive, Soviet troops were in a state of reorganization. Many units were bled white by previous battles, and reinforcements did not have time to master equipment and weapons. Mid-level commanders, most of whom had minimal combat experience, were not ready for maneuver warfare in conditions of deep enemy tank breakthroughs. The morning of October 2, 1941 was foggy. At 5:30 a.m., the roar of thousands of cannons shattered the silence of Soviet positions. The artillery preparation for Operation Typhoon had begun. German aviation, in waves, crashed down upon defensive lines, command posts, and communication hubs. The earth trembled from the explosions of bombs and shells. Communication between Soviet headquarters was severed in the very first hours of the offensive. Hoth's Panzer Group delivered a powerful blow to the junction of the Western and Reserve fronts. 500 tanks, supported by aviation, surged into the gap between the 30th and 19th Armies. Soviet anti-tank assets proved powerless against the concentrated armored might of the Wehrmacht. By the end of the first day of the offensive, German tanks had advanced 20 kilometers deep into the defense. On the southern sector, Guderian's panzer group broke through the defenses of the Bryansk front. German tank divisions, operating according to the classic blitzkrieg scheme, bypassed pockets of resistance, striving to reach operational space. Infantry formations cleared the territory of encircled Soviet units, while tanks irresistibly pressed forward. General Eremenko attempted to organize a counterattack with reserve forces, but the fragmented actions of Soviet units could not stop the German tank wedge. By the evening of October 3, Guderian's group had advanced 40 kilometers, creating a threat of encirclement for the entire Bryansk front. The Soviet command found itself paralyzed by the swiftness of the German offensive. Army headquarters, having lost contact with frontline command, acted disjointedly. Attempts to organize a continuous line of defense failed. German tanks appeared where they were not expected. Anti-tank artillery, the main hope in the fight against armored vehicles, often found itself without infantry support and became easy prey for German submachine gunners. Soviet aviation, outnumbered by the Luftwaffe, could not provide cover for ground troops. By the end of October 3, the advanced units of Hoth's panzer group had advanced 80 kilometers, and Guderian's tanks 70. The German pincers were relentlessly closing. The command of the Western and Reserve fronts belatedly realized the scale of the catastrophe. But the time for an organized retreat had been lost. The Stavka demanded holding positions at all costs, not understanding that the front had already been cut into pieces. On October 4, German tank divisions continued their rapid advance. Their goal was to link up near Vyazma, to close the encirclement ring around the main forces of the Western and Reserve fronts. On October 6, 1941, what the Soviet command had so feared came to pass. The armored wedges of the Wehrmacht linked up east of Vyazma. Advance units of Goth's 3rd Panzer Group and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group met in the Spaz-Demensk area, closing the first encirclement ring. The main forces of the Western and Reserve fronts, 5 armies, about 60 divisions, over 500,000 men, found themselves in a gigantic cauldron. The German command acted according to a well-rehearsed scheme. While the armored formations closed the outer encirclement ring, infantry divisions formed the inner ring, dissecting the Soviet grouping into isolated pockets of resistance. Luftwaffe aircraft continuously bombed concentrations of Soviet troops, striking at command posts, artillery positions, and columns. Simultaneously, on the southern sector of the front, the encirclement of the main forces of the Bryansk front was completed. Guderian's tanks, having executed a deep flanking maneuver, linked up with units of the Wehrmacht's 2nd Army in the Trubchevsk area. 3 Soviet armies, about 200,000 men, found themselves in the Bryansk cauldron. At the Stavka of the Supreme High Command, the scale of the catastrophe was belatedly realized. On October 7, Stalin dispatched his deputy, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, to the disaster area, tasking him with stabilizing the front at any cost. But opportunities for maneuver were extremely limited. Reserves were absent, and the encircled troops were losing control. Chaos reigned within the cauldrons themselves. Communication between units was absent, ammunition was running out, and fuel for equipment was scarce. General Konev, commander of the Western Front, lost control of his troops. Army commanders tried to independently organize defense and a breakout from the encirclement. General Lukin, commander of the 19th Army, assumed leadership of the northern group of encircled troops. He ordered the formation of a strike force to break through to the east. General Bolden, deputy commander of the Western Front, led the southern group. Despite the lack of centralized command, Soviet commanders showed initiative, striving to extricate their troops from the deadly trap. The first breakout attempts began on October 8th. Composite detachments, reinforced by remnants of tank brigades, attacked German positions. But the enemy, anticipating these strikes, had created a powerful anti-tank defense. Most attacks faltered under artillery fire and airstrikes. Time worked against the encircled. With each passing day, the ring tightened. The territory of the cauldrons shrank, and ammunition dwindled. The German command methodically destroyed scattered groups of Soviet troops, preventing them from uniting for a joint breakthrough. The scale of the catastrophe near Vyazma and Bryansk was truly horrifying. The main forces of 3 Soviet fronts were trapped in 2 gigantic encirclements. The 19th, 20th, 24th, and 32nd Armies of the Western Front, as well as the 32nd, 43rd, and 50th Army Corps of the Reserve Front, found themselves encircled at Vyazma. In total, this cauldron contained about 37 divisions, 9 tank brigades, 13 artillery regiments of the RGK, over 400,000 people. In the Bryansk cauldron were 3 armies, the 3rd, 13th, and 50th, numbering a total of about 200,000 soldiers and commanders. The fate of the command staff was particularly tragic. Encircled were Lieutenant General Mikhail Lukin, commander of the 19th Army, Lieutenant General Philip Urshakov, commander of the 20th Army, Major General Konstantin Rakutin, commander of the 24th Army, and Major General Sergei Vishnevsky, commander of the 32nd Army. 12 generals from the senior command staff were captured. Army headquarters, in the conditions of encirclement, tried to establish control over the troops, but this was extremely difficult due to the lack of reliable communication. Many staff officers died during bombardments and artillery shelling. Staff documentation was in most cases destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The encircled troops experienced a severe shortage of ammunition, fuel, and provisions. Tank brigades, having exhausted their fuel, were forced to destroy their equipment. Artillery units, having fired all their ammunition, blew up their guns. By October 10th, most Soviet divisions in the encirclement had lost their combat effectiveness as organized formations. The situation of the wounded, whose number constantly grew, was particularly difficult. Medical services, deprived of medicines and dressings, could not cope with the flow of casualties. Field hospitals that fell into encirclement became easy prey for the enemy. Despite the catastrophic situation, many commanders showed exceptional courage and initiative. Lieutenant General Lukin and his deputy, Major General Bolden, organized a strike group from the remnants of the 19th and 20th Armies for a breakthrough. Commander of the 50th Army, Major General Petrov, managed to maintain control over his troops and organize their withdrawal from the encirclement in relatively organized columns. When it became clear that hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled near Vyazma and Bryansk, the Supreme High Command made desperate attempts to relieve the besieged troops. On October 8, 1941, a new Western Front was formed under the command of Army General Georgy Zhukov. He was tasked with organizing counterattacks to break through to the encircled armies. The first counterattack was launched by the forces of the 5th Army, under General Lelyushenko in the direction of Zhatsk. Newly formed divisions, reinforced by tank brigades, attacked German positions, trying to break through a corridor to the Vyazma pocket. However, the German command, anticipating such actions, had established a strong defense. The counterattack faltered under massive artillery fire and airstrikes. Northwest of Moscow, the 30th Army also attempted to break through to the encircled troops. Its units advanced several kilometers, but were stopped by counterattacks from enemy tank reserves. The army commander, General Khomenko, was seriously wounded, which disorganized troop command and control. Soviet aviation played a special role in the attempts to relieve the encircled troops. Despite the overwhelming superiority of the Luftwaffe, Soviet pilots conducted heroic sorties, delivering ammunition and medical supplies to the pockets, evacuating the wounded, and supporting ground troops with assault strikes. The commander of the Western Front's Air Force, General Spytov, organized an airlift to the encircled groups. Pilots landed on improvised airfields, often under enemy fire. On October 12th, a new attempt to break through to the encircled troops began. A strike group under the command of General Rokossovsky, which included the 126th and 128th Tank Brigades, attacked German positions in the Volokholamsk area. After fierce fighting, Soviet tanks advanced 10 kilometers, but further offensive was halted by enemy reserves that had been brought up. Why did all attempts to relieve the encircled troops end in failure? The main reason was the lack of sufficient reserves for the Soviet command. Most combat-ready units were already in the pockets. Newly formed divisions were inexperienced and poorly equipped. There was a shortage of tanks, artillery, and communication equipment. The German command, understanding the danger of Soviet counterattacks, created a strong defense along the outer perimeter of the encirclement. Wehrmacht tank divisions, having completed the encirclement, were redeployed to the most threatened directions. The Luftwaffe completely dominated the air, preventing Soviet troops from maneuvering and regrouping forces. By mid-October, it became obvious that it would be impossible to relieve the encircled troops from the outside. Zhukov made the difficult decision to concentrate all forces on creating a new defensive line to protect Moscow. Radiograms were sent to the encircled troops with an order to break through independently in small groups, not counting on outside help. Encircled, Soviet soldiers displayed incredible courage and resilience. Finding themselves in a hopeless situation, without communication with command, without supplies or support, they continued to fight. In the Vyazma pocket, General Lukin managed to organize an all-round defense from the remnants of the 19th and 20th Armies. Dispersed units rallied around command posts, forming pockets of resistance. Every meter of land cost the Germans heavy losses. Soviet artillerymen, expending their last shells, fired directly at advancing German tanks. When ammunition ran out, soldiers went into bayonet charges. The 454th Rifle Regiment of the 113th Division, under the command of Colonel Mironov, held a height near the village of Bogoroditskoye for 3 days, repelling 17 enemy attacks. When the defenders ran out of ammunition, the surviving soldiers, led by the regimental commissar, launched a final counterattack and died in hand-to-hand combat. Heroism was displayed not only by individual units, but also by lone soldiers. Red Army soldier Ivan Gudkov of the 127th Rifle Division, left alone at an anti-tank gun, knocked out 3 German tanks, and when the shells ran out, he threw himself with grenades under a 4th. In the Bryansk pocket, the 50th Army of General Petrov particularly distinguished itself. Its units systematically retreated eastward, conducting rearguard actions. The 194th Rifle Division of Colonel Vyazma created a mobile defense, launching counterattacks on the flanks of the advancing enemy. The German command was forced to redeploy additional forces to combat the encircled troops, which slowed their advance towards Moscow. Organizing a defense under encirclement demanded exceptional skill from commanders. General Bolden, finding himself in the Vyazma pocket, divided his available forces into mobile detachments capable of rapid movement and striking enemy communications. Each detachment received a clear objective and direction for breakthrough. Tankers of the 32nd Tank Brigade, having run out of fuel, used their vehicles as stationary firing points, turning them into improvised pillboxes. Artillery batteries established all-round defense, repelling attacks from all directions. Political workers played a special role, maintaining the morale of the encircled troops. Commissars and political instructors inspired soldiers to resist by personal example. In critical moments, they led counterattacks, raising people into battle. The regimental commander of the 144th Rifle Division, Major Novikov, addressing the soldiers before the breakthrough, said, "We are surrounded, but not defeated. The motherland awaits us alive and with weapons in hand." These words became a motto for many encircled soldiers. Even in a hopeless situation, Soviet soldiers did not lose heart. They understood that every day of resistance was a contribution to the defense of Moscow, time gained for preparing new defensive lines. Commanders told soldiers, "We are holding the Germans here so they don't go further." And these words were true. The heroic resistance in the pockets indeed tied up significant Wehrmacht forces, preventing them from developing their offensive on the capital at the same pace. In encirclement, Soviet commanders proved themselves to be true leaders, capable of making decisions in critical conditions. Lieutenant General Mikhail Lukin, commander of the 19th Army, finding himself in the Vyazma pocket, took command of the northern grouping of encircled troops. Tall, fit, with a strong-willed face and a penetrating gaze, Lukin maintained composure even in the most difficult moments. When he was informed about the closing of the encirclement ring, he calmly replied, "We will break through to the east. As long as we have weapons and ammunition, we are an army, not prisoners." Lukin organized combined detachments from scattered units, created a unified command system, and determined the direction of the main thrust. On October 12th, severely wounded, he continued to lead the troops until he lost consciousness from blood loss. Captured, General Lukin maintained his dignity even in a German hospital, refusing to cooperate with the enemy. Lieutenant General Ivan Boldin, deputy commander of the Western Front, showed exceptional energy and initiative. Finding himself encircled with a group of staff officers, he gathered scattered units around him and formed a combat-ready detachment. "They encircled us, but did not defeat us," Boldin told the soldiers. He developed a breakthrough plan, dividing forces into mobile groups, and personally led one of them. Breaking through German barriers, Boldin's detachment destroyed several enemy strongholds and led about 10,000 people out of the encirclement. The commander of the 20th Army, Lieutenant General Philip Urshakov, made one of the most difficult decisions in his life. When it became clear that it was impossible for the entire army to break through, he ordered the destruction of heavy weapons and equipment, and for the personnel to leave the encirclement in small groups. "It's better to lose equipment than people," Urshakov said at the last meeting of commanders. The general himself remained with the rear guard, covering the retreat of the main forces. In the Bryansk pocket, Major General Mikhail Petrov, commander of the 50th Army, managed to maintain control of the troops in a critical situation. He organized an all-round defense and methodically withdrew units to the east, repelling enemy attacks. When ammunition ran out, Petrov ordered a breakthrough in separate groups. "Our task is to return to duty and continue the fight." Such was the order received by unit commanders. Divisional and regimental commanders showed no less courage and initiative. Colonel Akimov, commander of the 126th Rifle Division, organized a breakthrough through a swampy forest mass, which the Germans considered impassable. Thanks to this decision, a significant part of the division broke out of the encirclement. Major General Presnov, commander of the 113th Rifle Division, wounded in both legs, continued to lead the battle, lying on a ground sheet. When they wanted to evacuate him, he refused. "As long as the division is encircled, I remain with it." The fate of many commanders was tragic. Major General Vishnevsky, commander of the 32nd Army, died during the breakthrough from encirclement. Colonel Pushkin, commander of the 128th Tank Brigade, having used all his shells, directed his tank at a cluster of German equipment. The decisions made by commanders in encirclement often determined the life and death of thousands of people. Not all of these decisions were optimal. Fatigue, lack of information, psychological pressure took their toll. But even in these conditions, Soviet military leaders retained the ability to analyze the situation and act decisively. By mid-October 1941, breaking out of encirclement became the only chance for salvation for hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets. Commanders of encircled units made decisions to break out independently, without communication with higher headquarters. In the Vyazma pocket, General Lukin organized the first major breakout attempt on October 11th. A composite detachment of units from the 19th Army attacked German positions near the village of Bogoroditskoye. Soviet soldiers managed to punch a hole in the encirclement ring, but they failed to develop the success. German aviation unleashed a barrage of bombs on those who had broken through, and tanks and motorized infantry blocked the corridor. Of the 5,000 men who participated in the breakout, only a few hundred reached their own lines. General Lukin's fate was tragic. Twice wounded, with an amputated leg, he was captured by the Germans in an unconscious state. The commander of the 20th Army, General Urshakov, attempted a breakout to the northeast. He divided the remaining forces into several combat groups, which were to break through in different directions to disperse the enemy's forces. The shock group under his personal command managed to advance about 10 kilometers, but was stopped near the village of Semlevo. In a fierce battle, General Urshakov was severely wounded and captured. In the Bryansk pocket, the actions of General Petrov's 50th Army proved more successful. He organized a large-scale breakout in the southeastern direction. By creating a strong vanguard from the remnants of tank brigades and artillery regiments, Petrov managed to punch a hole in the inner ring of the encirclement. Over 3 days of fierce fighting, a significant part of the army broke out of the pocket. About 15,000 men, with weapons and even some artillery, reached Soviet positions. The commander of the 149th Rifle Division, Colonel Bolden, applied unconventional tactics. He divided the division into small groups of 30 to 40 men, each under the command of an experienced officer. The groups broke through independently, avoiding roads and settlements, moving primarily at night. Thanks to this decision, about 2,000 soldiers of the division were able to reach their own lines. Many breakouts ended tragically. A composite detachment from units of the 32nd Army, numbering about 3,000 men, attempted to break through near the village of Kolmzherkovsky. Meeting strong resistance, the detachment veered north and ran into a minefield. Under fire from German artillery and airstrikes, the detachment was almost completely annihilated. Only a few individuals escaped the encirclement. The fate of the 173rd Rifle Division was heroic and tragic. Its commander, Colonel Bogdanov, organized a breakout on the night of October 14th. The soldiers attacked German positions without artillery preparation, in complete silence, with fixed bayonets. The surprise of the attack allowed them to break through the first line of defense, but a fierce battle ensued at the second line. Colonel Bogdanov personally led the soldiers into the attack and died, struck by a machine gun burst. The remnants of the division scattered through the forests, and only small groups managed to reach their own lines. The fate of Soviet prisoners of war, captured in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets, became one of the most tragic pages of the Great Patriotic War. According to German data, in October 1941 alone, over 600,000 Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. Exhausted by battles, hungry, often wounded, they found themselves in conditions incompatible with survival. The German command was not prepared for such a large number of prisoners and did not strive to provide them with minimally acceptable living conditions. For many, the first days of captivity were their last. Emaciated people were driven on foot for tens of kilometers without food or water. Those who collapsed from exhaustion and could not go on were shot on the spot by their escorts. Eyewitnesses recalled endless columns of prisoners, trudging along autumn roads in the rain and snow. Along the roads lay the bodies of those who could not endure this terrible march. For most prisoners, the first refuge was hastily organized open-air camps, the so-called dulags. These were simply fields enclosed with barbed wire, where people were kept without shelter, without basic sanitary conditions. In Vyazma, such a camp was established on the territory of a former brick factory. Tens of thousands of people were in an open area, without shelter from rain and cold. The daily ration consisted of 200 grams of ersatz bread and a liter of thin soup made from unpeeled vegetables. Water was given in minimal quantities, often from contaminated sources. In such conditions, infectious diseases, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, spread rapidly. Medical assistance was practically non-existent. In the camp near Roslavl, according to survivors, up to 500 people died daily. Bodies were stacked outside the camp boundaries, without even the possibility of burying them properly. With the onset of cold weather, the situation worsened even further. Most prisoners were in summer uniforms, without warm clothing. Night frosts claimed hundreds of lives. People tried to keep warm by huddling closely together, digging holes in the ground to shelter from the wind. The fate of the wounded was particularly difficult. Without medical assistance, many died from blood poisoning and gangrene. As German troops advanced deeper into Soviet territory, prisoners were moved to permanent camps, stalags and oflags. But even there, conditions remained catastrophic. In Stalag 352 in Minsk, where a significant portion of the prisoners from Vyazma were sent, mortality reached 30% monthly. By the spring of 1942, only a small fraction of those captured in the autumn of 1941 remained alive. The fate of the command staff was tragic. Generals Lukin, Yershakov, Vishnevsky, who were captured while breaking out of encirclement, were sent to special officer camps in Germany. The German command tried to persuade them to cooperate, but was refused. Many officers preferred death to betrayal. The exact number of those who died in captivity after the Vyazma and Bryansk catastrophes is impossible to determine. According to various estimates, no more than 80,000 people from the encircled armies managed to break through to their own positions. About 120,000 died in battles during attempts to break through. The rest, over 400,000, were taken prisoner, and most of them died in the first months of captivity. Surviving prisoners often faced suspicion and distrust after liberation. Many passed through NKVD filtration camps, some were repressed. Only in the 1990s did the state officially recognize former prisoners of war as victims of the war and participants in hostilities. The Vyazma tragedy remained in the shadow of other war events for many years. Only in the post-Soviet era did historians gain access to archival documents, allowing them to reconstruct the scale of this catastrophe and pay tribute to hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers whose lives ended in German captivity. From among those encircled who did not lay down their arms, the first partisan detachments began to form. Soldiers and officers who had lost contact with their units but retained the will to resist went into the forests to continue the struggle in the enemy's rear. This process was not spontaneous. It was organized by experienced commanders and political workers who understood that in the new conditions, the tactics of struggle needed to change. In the forests of Smolensk and Bryansk regions, small groups of 15 to 20 people emerged, gradually uniting into larger formations. Major Kozubsky, a former artillery battalion commander, gathered around 40 fighters from various units and created the first partisan detachment in the Dorogobuj area. Armed with several machine guns and rifles, the detachment began to operate on enemy communications. Political workers played a special role in organizing the partisan movement. Battalion Commissar Orlov, finding himself encircled with a group of Red Army soldiers, established contact with local residents and created a base in a dense forest. By the end of October, his detachment already numbered over 100 people and was even armed with 2 mortars, saved during the breakout from encirclement. The first partisan operations were aimed at disrupting German communications. Lieutenant Kovalev's detachment, operating in the Vyazma area, blew up a railway track on the night of October 23rd, causing an ammunition train to derail. Captain Jabo's group ambushed a German convoy with fuel on the Yelnya-Dorogobuj road and destroyed it. Gradually, partisan tactics improved. From individual acts of sabotage, they moved to complex operations. In early November, several detachments operating in the Bryansk forests united under the command of Colonel Streltsov and carried out a coordinated attack on the German garrison in the village of Navlia. As a result of the sudden night raid, an ammunition depot and the commandant's office were destroyed, and weapons and provisions were captured. The German command, occupied with the offensive on Moscow, initially underestimated the danger of the partisan movement. Rear communications were poorly guarded, which allowed partisans to operate relatively freely. However, by mid-November, the Germans began to carry out their first anti-partisan operations, involving security divisions and police battalions. An important aspect of partisan activity was intelligence. Detachments operating in the enemy's rear collected valuable information about the movements of German troops and transmitted it across the front line. Senior Lieutenant Klimov's group, which had a radio station, regularly reported to the Soviet command on the movement of German columns along the Minsk highway, which allowed for airstrikes against them. The partisan movement became an important factor in the fight against the invaders. The German command was forced to divert significant forces to guard rear facilities and communications. Every train derailed, every bridge blown up, every convoy destroyed. All this complicated the supply of the Wehrmacht troops advancing on Moscow, and ultimately contributed to the disruption of the plan for the lightning capture of the Soviet capital. The catastrophe near Vyazma and Bryansk had many causes, woven into a tragic knot of circumstances. Strategic miscalculations by the Soviet command began long before October 41st. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command failed to correctly determine the direction of the main German thrust, expecting it in the southern direction. When intelligence reported the concentration of tank formations in the Moscow direction, this information did not receive due assessment. Stalin, still under the impression of the Kiev catastrophe, did not believe in the possibility of a new, powerful Wehrmacht offensive. The system of troop control played a fateful role. Excessive centralization of decision-making, where front commanders could not independently maneuver forces without coordination with the Stavka, led to the loss of precious time. When German tanks had already broken through the defenses, many commanders were still waiting for orders from above. Army General Georgy Zhukov, later analyzing the causes of the defeat, noted, "We still did not know how to manage large masses of troops in a dynamic environment. The enemy imposed his will on us, and we reacted with a delay." The communication situation proved catastrophic. Army headquarters often had no contact with divisions, and front commands with armies. There were not enough radio stations, and wired communication was severed by airstrikes and sabotage groups. As a result, many units acted blindly, unaware of the situation in neighboring sectors. Tactical errors exacerbated strategic miscalculations. The defense was built on a linear principle, without creating deeply echeloned positions. Anti-tank artillery was distributed evenly along the front, instead of being concentrated in tank-dangerous directions. Reserves were located too close to the front line and fell under airstrikes even before entering battle. A significant problem was the insufficient training of troops. After the heavy summer battles, many divisions received reinforcements of inexperienced recruits who had no combat experience. Mid-level commanders lacked the skills of maneuverable defense against enemy tank wedges. The lack of modern weaponry also played a role. Most Soviet tanks were inferior to German ones in speed and maneuverability. Anti-tank artillery often could not penetrate the armor of the newest German vehicles. Aviation, having suffered heavy losses in the first months of the war, could not provide cover for ground troops. Comparing the Vyazma catastrophe with other operations, one can note that the Soviet command learned lessons from this defeat. Already in December 41st, during the counter-offensive near Moscow, a new tactic was applied. The concentration of forces in narrow breakthrough sectors, the creation of mobile reserves, and improved interaction between branches of service. In 42nd year near Stalingrad, Soviet troops skillfully organized a deeply echeloned defense and were able to wear down the enemy before the decisive counterattack. By 43rd year, the Red Army learned to counter the Wehrmacht's tank wedges, creating anti-tank areas and employing maneuverable defense. The Vyazma tragedy became a terrible but necessary lesson, which was paid for by the lives of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. This lesson subsequently allowed similar catastrophes to be avoided, and ultimately led to victory. The Vyazma and Bryansk catastrophes of October 1941 were not just a military defeat. They changed the course of the war, influencing the strategy of the Soviet command and the subsequent defense of Moscow. By pinning down significant Wehrmacht forces, the encircled armies gained precious time to prepare the capital's defense. Each day of heroic resistance in the pockets slowed the advance of German troops, allowing for the evacuation of industrial enterprises, mobilization of resources, and the bringing up of reserves from the east of the country. Historian Alexander Isayev noted, "The German offensive on Moscow bogged down not only due to the mud and frost, but also because the best divisions of the Wehrmacht were exhausted in battles with the encircled Soviet troops." Indeed, Army Group Center lost the momentum of its offensive, forced to commit significant forces to fight the pockets. The Soviet command learned bitter lessons from this tragedy. Already in November 1941, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command began to form a deeply echeloned defense, create mobile reserves, and improve the troop control system. Anti-tank defense tactics were revised. Artillery began to concentrate on likely directions of tank attacks, and anti-tank areas were created. In subsequent years of the war, similar catastrophes were avoided. Even under the most difficult conditions of the summer of 1942 in the south of the country, the Soviet command managed to organize a systematic withdrawal of troops, preventing a large-scale encirclement. For many years, the tragedy near Vyazma and Bryansk remained overshadowed by other events of the war. Official historiography spoke only of heavy fighting, without mentioning the scale of losses and the number of prisoners. The fates of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who died in encirclement or perished in captivity remained unknown. Only in the 1990s did a serious study of these events begin. Archival documents were declassified, and memoirs of surviving participants were published. The names of many heroes, whose deeds had remained in oblivion for decades, became known. Today, memorial complexes have been created at the battle sites near Vyazma and Bryansk. A special place is occupied by the Bogoroditskoye Pole Memorial near Vyazma, where thousands of fallen defenders of the fatherland rest in mass graves. Every year, search teams find the remains of fallen soldiers, establish their names, bringing back from oblivion the memory of the heroes. The Vyazma tragedy reminds us of the price of victory, of the self-sacrifice of those who, at the cost of their lives, stopped the enemy at the approaches to Moscow. As Marshal Zhukov said, "We won the Battle of Moscow not only at the last line of defense, but also in the October battles near Vyazma and Bryansk, where thousands of soldiers gave their lives, holding back the enemy's onslaught."